Hey folks, that's, wow, I didn't even need to like clink a glass or anything. Thank you for your attention. We're, last couple of people can trickle in, but I know we're getting into dinner time for everyone, so we should just get the ball rolling. I want to first thank Neil Brenner and Sabina Sheck, my colleagues in CEGU, for helping organize this, and especially also thank Carlo Diaz and Karen Martin, and I think I see Stella back there doing important work too. Thanks, Stella, for making this all happen logistically, and to everyone for coming, especially to our guests for dealing with yet another weekend of crazy air travel scenarios to make it here. So for those of you who don't know me and don't know what we're all about here, my name is Evan Carver. I'm an assistant instructional professor in the relatively new program on environment, geography, and urbanization, which is part of the Committee on Environment, Geography, and Urbanization. This committee is less than a couple years old, and it's been conceived as being an interdisciplinary platform for research, pedagogy, and debate about issues related to sustainability, environmental policy, spatial sciences, and spatial media, among other things. I kind of want to emphasize that it's a platform for debate, which means that all of you have a role here tonight. We have very esteemed speakers, but we also have plenty of time for Q&A. So I'm looking forward to the discussion. I just wanted to maybe, before inviting our first speaker up, just kind of share a couple of thoughts that I was having on the way here that I think maybe help kind of set the tone. Just a couple of days ago, one of my literary heroes passed away. He was the Serbian-American poet named Charles Simic. I don't know if anyone had heard of him. He was poet laureate of the US for some years. But anyway, I was looking back at some of his poems and essays to reflect, and he wrote a lot about his upbringing in Yugoslavia, where he lived through first Nazi invasion and then the rise of a Stalinist dictatorship. And these experiences left him, as he put it in a later essay, stubbornly suspicious to mass enthusiasms. And this sentiment, I don't have anything like the life experiences that Charles Simic had, but this sentiment kind of hit me with a jolt of recognition. I don't think just because I was never like the trendy kid, but because I think there are a lot of good reasons to be sort of allergic to mass enthusiasms like this. He puts it later in this same essay that millions perished or lost everything while huge intellectual and military efforts were being made to obliterate or circumvent the conscience of countless human beings. I think we should note his formulation there, that the intellectual efforts precede the military ones, and that the loss of human life is almost just like a byproduct of the loss of conscience. So I think it's important for those of us who are in the intellectual business to be wary of mass enthusiasms and totalizing ideas, especially at times like this, maybe, where the globalization of everything, trade, finance, climate, can invite those theories of everything. And most sort of insidiously result in very circumscribed ways of knowing and being in the world. I think our speakers are sympathetic to this sentiment, especially when it comes to issues related to climate change and our reactions to it. Stephanie has written that she's exhausted by the apocalyptic and hateful images being forced on us by political culture and the rigid modes of discourse that now portray life in the Anthropocene. The problem with those rigid modes of discourse is that the possibility of imagining or creating different worlds disappears. It's also Stephanie. So yeah, I want to apologize maybe to the audience a little bit, because I think that in advertising this event, we might be trafficking in some of those terms and images, even though we do kind of intend to be critiquing them. So you can tell us at the end whether you think we're part of the problem or not. But critique itself even can be one of those kind of, at its worst, can be one of those mass enthusiasms that obscures more than it enlightens. But I'm hopeful that we're not going that direction, that we're not going to just be sort of sharing with you sort of shop-worn denunciations of global finance and recycled images of apocalypse. What really excites me about the work that our guests are doing is that they move beyond this diagnosis of a problem, and that they do shine a light on moments of resistance, prefigurations of a different world, but not in a sort of a sci-fi utopian way or in a kind of a sterilized Photoshop rendering kind of a way, but in a way that really dwells in and celebrates the messy real world where people are reusing, reappropriating, reshaping materials and spaces to build the world that we need. Anyway, with that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Stephanie Wakefield. She is an assistant professor and director of the Human Ecology program at Life University, where she teaches courses on urban resilience and sustainability, human-environment interactions, and social ecological systems thinking. She has been a fellow at Florida International University in Miami and has taught at the New School and Queens College in New York. Her work as an urban geographer analyzes the technical, political, and philosophical transformations of urban life in the Anthropocene, and she's the author of the book Anthropocene Back Loop, Experimentations in Unsafe Operating Space. She is also the co-editor of Resilience in the Anthropocene, Governance and Politics at the End of the World. I can also recommend the chapter that she wrote in that book, which I was quoting from a minute ago. She has also just finished a new book called The City in the Anthropocene, and I think probably she's going to be sharing with us some of the stuff from that book. So I'll just turn it over to Stephanie. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Evan, for that really awesome introduction. And thank you to everyone here at CEGU, to Neil and Sabina, and Danielle and Carlo, and also Gurga and Alexander, for all the hospitality and for having me here. It's really a pleasure to be here. I think that the work that you are all doing is super exciting. I think academia is a very crazy place to be trying to think and act in the world in this time in history, and it's a really exciting to see some creative, comradely, kind of collective discussion and engagement. It's really cool. So, thank you. So, with the time that I have here, I just want to lay out a couple of ideas and thoughts for discussion and debate, definitely, around the topic of urban resilience. So, and some of this will draw on the book that Evan mentioned that I just finished, The City in the Anthropocene, which is based on research in Miami. So I'll talk a little bit about that. I've been looking at resilience in the urban context for really the last decade and watching it become the dominant design, and planning and governance methodology in most global cities around the world, and also small cities. It has become a sort of methodology and framework for thinking about how do you adapt cities and existing urban systems to climate change and its impacts. So sea level rise, floods, hurricanes, wildfires, and so on. And just to kind of say this up front, the way that I think about urban resilience is that it is it's a process of urbanization specific to the Anthropocene, right, and specific to this historical moment that is producing, very, unique urban spaces and forms of infrastructure. Okay, and I think these are really interesting in and of themselves to try to map and understand and kind of see as these emergent new spatial formations. Right? But also resilience and urban resilience, more specifically, is very much an idea of life, an idea of what human life can be in the Anthropocene and what it should be in the Anthropocene. So to kind of, give you some examples of what I mean by that, let me just talk about Miami for just a second. So who's been to Miami? I'm just curious. Usually it's like 50% of the room. Yeah, okay, cool. So everyone's probably been there a little bit. We tend to think about Miami as a place that's like, sun and beaches and maybe like music videos or whatever. But now Miami is also becoming known as sort of sea level rise ground zero in the United States. And so it's this, densely developed urban strip along the southeastern coast of Florida, as you can see, surrounded by water. Right? And the reason it's considered sea level rise ground zero is not only because it's coastal and low-lying, but also because Miami sits on this unique porous limestone foundation, which is like Swiss cheese, meaning that water from flooding and sea rise and so on doesn't just come from the coastline, but it comes up through like street drains and foundations and even parking garages, right? So this presents really unique design challenges, adaptation, and resiliency challenges. And what we're seeing, this is a video I made by where I used to live in Miami. In case you were wondering, is it real? This is sunny day flooding, meaning this is not rain. This is just king tides, high tides that you get several times a year. So this is salt water in the street. So this is some sort of early onset sea level rise flooding that we see in Miami. And so this sort of onset of early sea rise and projections for it to increase quite a bit over the coming century have led to a lot of mediatized, sort of sensationalized a little bit depictions of the city as, doomed, the next Atlantis, goodbye Miami, as this Rolling Stone headline put it, I think in 2013. So this, generated a lot of, talk and, and so on in the city of Miami and around the counties that make up South Florida. And there was a real push to say, okay, how do we, not only mitigate and manage the impacts of flooding and sea rise on the city and the existing urban systems there, but also how do we manage the potential impact of these media projections, right, and media predictions of the city as doomed on real estate values, on property, and investor confidence in the city, right? So this has led to a pretty widespread process of experimentation with how do you make the city resilient? What kind of infrastructure do you need to adapt to multiple feet of sea rise coming? So some of this has taken the form of, just really traditional infrastructure, what we call gray infrastructure. So when we use the word infrastructure, we're typically talking about, roads, pipelines, bridges, electrical grids, things like that, right? And so that's definitely going on. And this is a picture of the street elevation that's happening in Miami Beach. And the goal is to eventually raise the entirety of Miami Beach 1.5 to 2 feet, so to mitigate flooding. But, and I think this is where things get really interesting, this attempt to sort of preserve Miami as it is and the sort of urban life as we know it there has also led to some very experimental new definitions of infrastructure. And so what you're seeing here, and that looks really nice, double, that looks great. What you're seeing here is the Everglades ecosystem. And so this is a vast regional ecosystem of fresh, slow-moving water that historically, before South Florida was urbanized in the late 19th and early 20th century, covered most of the lower half of the state in this slow-moving water. Right? And so there is the largest ecological restoration project I think ever done, underway to restore these flows of water, because in the 20th century they were compartmentalized, dammed, drained to build the very ground that Miami as we know it and urbanized South Florida as we know it stands on. Right? And so they were considered like a nuisance and impediment to urbanization at that time, right? But now, as with a lot of projects that are using natural systems as infrastructure, that's been reversed. So now the Everglades are seen as really valued. Why? It's because, when we think about the impacts of sea level rise on a city, we sometimes are thinking about like flooding and water in the streets, but no. One of the problems in Miami is the drinking water being infiltrated by salt water coming in from the oceans, right, into that water in the aquifer that's in that porous limestone, right, contaminating the drinking water. So the idea is that if you rehydrate these Everglades and they can recharge that fresh water by just moving naturally as they're imagined to do, right, historically, that they can push back on that saltwater intrusion. So this is a really interesting, new infrastructure project. Nature is infrastructure. That involves a lot of new massive engineering. It's not just about letting nature be, right? And it's also, I think, importantly transforming the relationship between the city and nature. So, again, this aerial view, this is the city, right, the urban area. This is what's typically called the not urban area, the Everglades. It's dark, right? But this non-urban area is now seen as an essential urban system, an essential urban infrastructure. Necessary for the city's survival. So this isn't water as an input that comes out of your tap, right? This is water as an eco-cybernetic stack that would interact with other natural processes, saltwater intrusion, and buffer their impacts on the city. Now, I think that's interesting in and of its own right, but let's leave it behind and move on to something else. What's very interesting about nature as infrastructure, and that's something that's being developed in a lot of cities, not just Miami. What's interesting about nature as infrastructure is that it sits alongside other attempts to redefine human life and human capacities as infrastructure as well. So what I'm talking about here is something that you can see in Miami, but there's a phenomenon that's much more widespread than that in cities and hinterlands around the country, which is we are seeing a massive uptick in the number of just ordinary people like you and me trying to sort of reclaim infrastructure, build infrastructure for self-sufficiency, for autonomy, maybe to learn survival skills, maybe to self-organize for disaster recovery and preparedness, right? Preppers, things like that. You all know about this. Some of you are probably preppers, I think. There's nothing wrong with that. It's really popular now. And I think this is fascinating. So we see it, in disaster recovery. This is the Cajun Navy in the Gulf Coast responding to hurricanes. This is a survival skills workshop in Miami, thinking about indigenous cultural autonomy and the infrastructure for that. We see, again, preppers on the right. Survival skills classes have never been more popular in the country than now. But we even see it in the realm of sort of, architecture. So this is a video that I made in just outside of New Orleans in a place called Old River Landing, where this is a Creole and Cajun working class kind of fishing community. And it sits outside the levee system on the Mississippi River. So this area floods frequently, quite dramatically, as you can see. And so what people have done here is rather than leave or abandon the area, they love this area. They love the idea of good life there. They've kind of come up with this DIY amphibious architecture. It's not just stilts. They kind of used YouTube and kind of came up with this on their own to retrofit their buildings and even a restaurant with styrofoam and poles and things like this so that they can rise and fall with the water. So really interesting forms of experimentation with the means of life. Oh, sorry about that. Let's bring it back. And by that term, I'm specifically referencing Marx, the means of subsistence, the means of existence, right? These are the tools and the practices through which people, create their worlds, form new worlds, and reappropriate forms of power, right? And I think there's something very important about the fact that people are exploring these, after work, on the weekends, with such energy and in such a widespread way at this historical moment. I think this is very much a response to the volatility of the world that we're seeing, not just climate change, but definitely that, disasters, supply chain disruptions, the pandemic, all these things, right? I think these are historical actions. They are responses to a moment of upheaval. But And so for that reason, I think they're really important and they have a lot of potential. But what we're also seeing is that in the realm of urban resilience, back to that, there is a lot of discussion amongst designers and planners and governments now, and even some academics about how those capacities of ordinary people to band together, to self-organize after a hurricane or what have you, to provide food and shelter for each other, that those are social infrastructure that needs to be developed and harnessed for cities, for the maintenance of the urban system, right, as it is, so that, so FEMA, for example, offers grants for community resilience. And the idea there is that, self-organized communities help the resilience of the broader city because you don't have to send out emergency relief agencies to those areas. People take care of themselves, right? So there's something there where I think there's a lot of potential being limited in this idea of social infrastructure, but there's also a bit more going on. Ultimately, what we're seeing is a vision of a resilient city, though, where, cities are viewed now by planners and designers and so on as this interlocking set, an eco-cybernetic interlocking set of systems, social infrastructure, ecological infrastructure, gray infrastructure. And the idea essentially is that you can kind of bring all of life into the domain of disaster management and survival, right? And so these natural processes and communities and capacities and so on are being sort of channeled towards maintaining what is, maintaining the urban geographies we know, the urban systems we know, and the economies that drive them, right? And so in a lot of cases, these resiliency drives can even be connected to not only preserving real estate and profits and so on, but also amping them up. So going back to Miami one last time, far from being the next Atlantis, at least yet, Miami right now is the most expensive housing market in America since the pandemic and has become this really big place of tech and crypto speculation. Right? Meanwhile, for the rest of people, ordinary people living in a city like Miami or anywhere else, you're sort of kind of left holding the bag, being social infrastructure, people who don't leave when there's a hurricane, people who will stay when it's flooding, and so on. You're becoming sort of social infrastructure whose function and purpose is to sort of get by amidst the world that is increasingly disastrous, right? And I think that in many ways is the idea of life that's forwarded by resilience. It's very much, at least in a conservative version, because of course there's many versions of resilience, right? But in a conservative reading, that is the idea that we don't change what is, we don't change the cause of the disasters. In fact, what you're getting with that sort of eco-cybernetic infrastructural stack is a new system of systems to kind of manage the impacts of the forms of urbanization that we inherit that are also there, right? Modern urbanization. Right? And just a quick provocative maybe note here. I just want to draw attention to the fact that this idea of life that we see in urban resilience and in resilience more broadly, I think is often unwittingly colonizing critical discourse in a lot of different disciplines. So whether we're talking about anthropology, critical theory, philosophy, even art and design, I think we often see an idea of what life is and can be in the Anthropocene that really mirrors resilience and actually sometimes makes it more explicit by sort of affirming it and articulating it. So I'm thinking, just to give one example, the work of Bruno Latour, rest in peace, he wrote a lot about this and really fleshed out this idea of, in the Anthropocene, in the age of climate change, that now, we need to kind of humble human being and become earthbound. So instead of this modern idea that humans exert agency on the world, it's sort of no more agents of history. We all agree on that. Instead, we should imagine life as this entangled meshwork, right, of humans and non-humans, and the non-human forces being much more powerful than humans, right? And I think that's worth noting and maybe trying to resist this kind of colonization of the imagination. And by that term, I'm thinking of the work of Julian Reed, because he wrote a lot about this, about the colonization of our imagination by resilience thinking. So one last thing, and then I'll stop talking. So that's one reading of resilience. That's sort of a dominant conservative mode of resilience. It's about maintaining existing systems, not stopping disaster, and just reducing life to survival within that. And if that's what resilience means, then yeah, I think we should resist it, as the title of these talks put it. But if we look at resilience's own conceptual framework, I think that we can get other ideas and another way of seeing the moment that we're in. So very briefly, for resilience ecologists like C.S. Halling, who in the 1970s invented this idea of resilience, everything in the world is a system, right? And city, my life, your life, an ecosystem, what have you. And every system goes through sort of two phases of life, a front loop, this here, and a back loop, this one here. A front loop is a period of sort of relative stability when it seems like everything's in its place, sort of structures, modes of thought, modes of doing. And a back loop is a time when those structures come undone. Right? It's a time of fragmentation, potentially of collapse, of discombobulation, but also a time for reorganization and experimentation. I think that we can absolutely see our moment right now in the world, historically, in what we call the Anthropocene and what some of us call the Anthropocene, as a back loop too. We're seeing the sort of returns on modern industrial society, right, play out in the present. And it's a time where it's not just environmental sort of degradation and collapse and coming undone, but also subjective, sort of unraveling and questioning and really seeking for other pathways forward. And if we see our time like this, I think it really gives us new ideas about what is possible, because resilience is one way of responding to a back loop, right? Resilience is where you kind of experiment in this time of upheaval to come up with new tools for keeping that loop going, right? Because it's an infinity loop, of course. At least that's one way of thinking about it. There's also transformative resilience, which can mean something very different. Ultimately, I think the key is this here. How do we get here? How do we open this door to that exit pathway? And the important thing to remember in a back loop is that it's a time of the unknown. Things are changing rapidly. A lot of things are possible. Resilience is one possibility, right? But there are others: surprise, novelty, transformation, escapes. Experimentation is the key. This is what resilience ecology and resilience design really emphasizes, but I think it can go in a lot of directions besides just maintaining the urban systems that we know. And so this is the last thing that I want to say, and then I'll leave it there. I think if we see our time through that lens, through a back loop, as this time of radical upheaval, if we really think the Anthropocene does institute radical upheaval in our world, then I think it means that rather than sort of just replicating or accepting this idea of resiliency as conserving what is and sort of just like getting by, I think that we can, as critical urban thinkers, as urban designers, and as just people in the world, we have a chance to really open up the playing field for thought and action, and to think, what can human life become at this historical moment? What can urban space become? What concepts are adequate to this moment, rather than maybe ones that we might just be kind of putting on top of it. And so I think that involves maybe reclaiming a little bit of that hubris that we are told maybe is out of date. Okay, thanks. Get out of your way.
Thank you, Stephanie. Take a second to finish writing down all those questions that you have for Stephanie. We're going to hear from Jeff first, and then have our Q&A at the end, discussion at the end with everyone, because I'm guessing that Jeff's presentation will cause you to amend or edit those questions for Stephanie also. So I'd like to introduce my good old friend and colleague, Jeff Howe. He's a professor and former chair of the Department of Landscape Architecture at the University of Washington in Seattle. He has been a City of Vienna visiting professor, and he co-founded the Pacific Rim Community Design Network. In a career that spans the Pacific, Jeff has worked with indigenous tribes, farmers, and fishers in Taiwan, neighborhood residents in Japan, villagers in China, and inner-city immigrant youths and elders in North American cities in projects ranging from conservation of wildlife habitats to design of urban open space. His numerous books include Insurgent Public Space, Guerrilla Urbanism and the Remaking of Contemporary Cities, Design as Democracy, Techniques for Collective Creativity, and the new Emerging Civic Urbanisms in Asia, Hong Kong, Seoul, Singapore, and Taipei Beyond Developmental Urbanization. I can also say from personal experience that Jeff is an extremely generous and supportive advisor of graduate students, and that might be among his most important contributions to the field. Jeff, thanks for having us. Come on up. Thanks for joining us. Come on up.
All right, let me get this to work first. So, and it may involve tweaking a little bit. All right. Okay. First of all, thank you to CEGU for such a wonderful invitation to come to Chicago. Ditto everything that Stephanie said about all the support that we have received as outside guests. It's great to catch up with Evan. Evan was one of my former graduate students, and it's good to see your former students doing well on their career. For those of you who know about my work, which has been focusing on public space and resistance, I actually have another identity as somebody who also teaches design in landscape architecture. And in landscape architecture, urban resilience is almost synonymous with this kind of large-scale physical infrastructure, right? The things that Stephanie have talked about before, coastal breakwater, stormwater systems, design competitions such as rebuilt by design, resilient by design, that privilege design solutions over other kinds of initiative. And so in a way, in speaking to the theme of the event for today, I've been resisting this kind of narrow focus on urban resilience. And instead, and of course, I've been drawn to a different source of resilience that are exemplified by grassroots initiative. So actions such as the Bike Brigade in New York City after Hurricane Sandy. We measured transportation corridors closed, including subway lines. It was the volunteer on bikes who were there first on the scene to bring emergency food and supply to those in need after Sandy. With neighborhoods out of power after the hurricane, it was the neighbors and volunteers again who set up pedal power charging stations so that people could recharge their phone and call their loved ones. 600 watts of love, as they call it. Community gardens becoming gathering places for neighbors to find support from each other. Also, in the aftermath of Sandy, including this Beach 91st Street Community Garden, which happened to just have opened a year before. And speaking of resistance and resilience, what could be more appropriate than Occupy Sandy, turning networks of mobilization formed during the Occupy Wall Street movement into relief effort after Sandy. And it was also around this time that I became interested in the connection between resistance movements and urban resilience. So in 2015, during my Fulbright study in Taipei, I started to look at grassroots initiative in the region that emerged after protest events, such as the Umbrella Movement in Hong Kong in 2014. This was taken by a friend of mine, and later that we used for the book cover for City Unsilenced. Specifically, grassroots initiatives such as Fixing Hong Kong, a group of carpenters, repair people, volunteers that were responsible for building the so-called self-study area during the movement so that students could study for exam during the protests, a rather peculiar phenomenon perhaps could only happen in East Asia, is given such a competitive academic environment there. After the movement, the same group of volunteers figured out a way to sustain their activism by offering free repair for people, especially in working class neighborhoods. And so they formed this group called Fixing Hong Kong as a way to engage people in conversations about democracy and social justice and to raise political awareness. They realized that it was the only way to get people to open their door and to have conversation about these important topics. And so I did some interview when I was there in 2015. They told me that sometimes a job could be very simple. It only takes like 3 minutes to finish, but 3 minutes was not long enough to have a sort of a substantive conversation about democracy. And so they will kind of extend the time a little bit, so it became 3 hours. Sometimes they would tell people that they forgot to bring their tool, so they come back the next day. So a 3-minute job became 2 days, 2 days job, a 3-day job. So I had the opportunity to shadow the group one evening in 2015 and learn more about their work, which is really absolutely fascinating. It was interesting hearing them talking about people that they met that evening, people that they were helping when they were doing home repair. And so one example was this, that one volunteer mentioned that one family had a broken fridge. And then another person mentioned that, they actually, there was a spare fridge that somebody had in another apartment. And so what started out as a simple home repair service became this kind of mutual aid effort. It was so interesting to see a network of volunteers, college students, social workers, office workers working alongside the repair people. In Taipei, one of the groups I follow was called Do You a Flavor, whose mission was to support people experiencing precarity, including the unhoused, street vendors, and so on. The group emerged in this case after the Sunflower Movement, in which young people occupied Taiwan's parliamentary chamber for 23 days in protest against the free trade agreement with China. So Taiwan at the time was governed by a pro-China administration. During the movement, members of Do You a Flavor, the volunteers in charge of handling donated food. And after the movement, they turned their activism to work on social issues such as homelessness. One of their best known and still active projects is called Stone Soup. It's a monthly gathering of volunteers who would solicit donated food materials, cook together, and share meals with folks on the streets. Hundreds of people, mostly young people and strangers to each other, would have signed up for these activities. And they don't just hand out foods to folks on the street. They will actually sit down, eat the meal with them, with people experiencing homelessness. And a real struggle that these people experience is not just like the lack of support, but also social isolation and stigma. So eating, sharing the meal with them was a way to kind of overcoming those barriers and struggle. In another project, this was actually funded by the Oxfam, they worked on redesigning the merchandise for the street vendors. And this wasn't just about like repackaging or redesigning the packaging, but also designing a way to link together organic producers, vendors, and consumers. So here you see at the bottom like the proportion of the profit that go to the different stakeholders. So 65% went to the producers, 20% for vendors, and the remaining for the operation costs of Do Your Flavor. So the work of these organizations, Do Your Flavor, Fixing Hong Kong, and there are many, many others, can be considered as a form of resistance. Resistance against tyranny in the case of Hong Kong, resistance against the exploitation of free trade and capitalism in the case of Taiwan. And the other kind of political agenda as part of the movement as well. But how do acts of resistance like these contribute to or constitute a form of resilience over time against crises and disasters? The COVID-19 pandemic turned out to be an opportunity to examine how these organizations handle crisis and emergency. In Hong Kong, during the height of the pandemic, Fixing Hong Kong shifted gear from doing home repair because they could not enter people's home then. So they shifted gear to distributing masks to those in need, which was in real short supply at the time. Specifically, they decided to focus their effort on the sanitation workers, who often did not have access to masks. And then it wasn't just about handing out masks. So like similar to the way Do Your Flavor approach their work. In this case, they reach out to the Sanitation Workers Association to learn about their daily routine, the location to where to find them, ways to better communicate and connect with folks they are trying to serve. And then through this process, Fixing Hong Kong was able to develop partnership and collaboration with other organizations and populations in society, right? And so a form of kind of radical mobilization that came out of these kind of mutual aid effort during the pandemic. In Taipei, during the pandemic, Do Your Flavor worked with, in a similar fashion to Fixing Hong Kong. They worked with other social service organizations and social innovation groups. There were 6 altogether in this particular initiative, and turned a community hub into a temporary logistics center for sorting and distribution of donated food and supplies. They figured out a system of collaboration. So some organizations were in charge of fundraising and soliciting donation. Others were in charge of checking in the donations, sorting, delivery, and so on. This particular hub was actually located in the neighborhood of Wanhua, which happened to be the epicenter of the worst COVID outbreak in Taipei in May of 2021. So that's the red blob that you see here in the corner. And that Fixing Hong Kong, the work went far beyond just delivery of goods. In this case, they raised enough money to hire people to perform these tasks. So people who lost their job during the pandemic, through this effort, were able to support their family with the income that they were able to receive from the work that they performed. Do Your Flavor also helped other organizations set up or join crowdfunding platforms. So these organizations, the 5 remaining organizations, are now able to reach out to a much wider audience, a network of supporters. The financial health of these organizations has improved as a result. And so this is really kind of what I consider as radical about the work that they do. So in July of 2020, I co-organized a webinar in collaboration with APRU, Association of Pacific Rim Universities, titled exactly Bottom-Up Resilience. We were joined by colleagues from various cities in East and Southeast Asia who share with us similar cases that they either have observed or have been involved with directly. We learned about the work of Life Cycle PH. It's a Manila-based organization that raised funds to provide bikes to healthcare workers so that they could go to work safely when the public transit system was shut down during the lockdown. We learned about Survival Pack, also in Manila. It's an effort that involved crowdfunding, again, delivering of food supply to help people who were out of work during the pandemic, particularly the many street vendors who lost their customers and their income due to the lockdown. Impact HK, a small homeless advocacy organization that saw the population that they were serving jump tenfold, from about 20 people a day to over 200. During the pandemic, they also started to partner with other organizations to provide temporary shelters for people experiencing homelessness. So people who, before the pandemic, was able to spend the night at a McDonald's or other kind of 24-hour fast food restaurant, but were not able to do so because the restaurant were forced to shut down during the lockdown. And our own Seattle Street Sync project is a project developed in partnership with Real Change, a homeless advocacy organization in Seattle, to provide people on the streets with a way to maintain their hygiene during the pandemic. The DIY design of the project allowed it to be replicated quickly throughout the city, hosted by businesses, nonprofit organizations, schools, and religious organizations. It was even adopted by a research center at Duke University that worked with the city of Durham to install 20 sinks in public spaces throughout the city. So what can we learn from these instances of bottom-up initiative, and what makes these efforts radical vis-a-vis the more kind of banal form of kind of resilience? So I'd like to finish by just offering a few observations. First, these initiatives are radical because, unlike the institutional practices of resilience, they are embedded in the local context, involving the mobilization of social relationship and existing assets and resources in the community. It was through these embeddedness that the initiative in turn strengthened the local community in terms of their ability to organize, to cope with, and to adapt to crisis and disturbance. Secondly, the initiative demonstrated the power of collaboration, partnership, and pulling together resources and assets, again, among networks of social groups and civil society organizations. The strengthening of these networks also contribute greatly to the future resilience of these communities. And then lastly, although this is not absolutely an exclusive list, the initiative demonstrates the greater subjectivity in terms of how communities and community organizations are able to take matters of responding to crises and disturbances into their hands. Rather than depending solely on institutional responses or outside aids that don't necessarily meet the needs of the local community, the organizations are able to develop more localized and self-determined responses that in turn strengthen their capacity and ability to respond to future crises. And through further advocacy and organizing, they could have the potential to overcome long-standing barriers, structural barriers facing these communities. And that, in my view, represents what is radical about this bottom-up initiative as a vehicle of resilience and resistance against the social and economic norm of society. Thank you.
Have a seat. Come on up, Stephanie. Thank you, you both. I'm going to take my prerogative here and ask the first question or two, but then I'm going to jump off the stage and walk around with this mic for all of your questions. You might notice that we're wearing mics and that I have this mic, but you don't actually hear anything amplified. This is being recorded for future replay, but the room's small enough that we don't actually need the amplification. So when I come to you with your question, just like pretend it's like when you're a kid and you had like your plastic ice cream cone or something that you were pretending was a microphone. Anyway, thank you guys both so much for these provocative and I think inspiring talks. Yeah, a couple of these stories I knew before, many of them not. Yes, especially all of the more recent ones from Taipei related to COVID, but even some of the prior ones are really, I think, kind of exciting and as you say, sort of radical. I did not know all about the bike brigade. I don't know who they had riding that bike. 600 watts is like. For me, it would be more like 200 watts of love that I could put out, but that's pretty awesome that they were able to put that together. So an initial question for you both. These examples of kind of grassroots resilience, or some of your examples of kind of DIY amphibious architecture and that kind of thing, as inspiring or as exciting as they might be, I can also imagine that they could be read as just this is exactly the kind of neoliberal logic of do it yourself. The state is not coming to rescue you. So in what way, am I being too cynical? And if I'm not being too cynical, tell me why. Why is this not just exactly what the kind of neoliberal logic of sort of minimal social support would have us do?
Do you want to answer first?
Sure, I can begin. No, this is a recurring question. Aside from the work that I presented today, I also I do a lot of research on community gardens, and that's a question that keeps coming up over and over again. Right, this kind of form of self-help that sort of relieve the responsibility of the state to take care of the citizens and community, right? And so in a way it incentivizes the state to kind of retreat from the public realm. And so I think there is some truth to that it is a slippery slope that does kind of relieve the state from the responsibility that they have. But I want to emphasize that a lot of the way I try to frame the examples I have is that they go beyond just the kind of knee-jerk responses, right, to crisis emergency. That there is a process that they go through in terms of building political capacity at the local level, in a way that eventually you hold the state responsible. Right? So that would be my response to that. That if we just stop at emergency relief and rescue, then you become a problem. Mm-hmm. But a lot of organizations, the work that they do is actually going beyond that, right? To really help building a network, strengthening their capacity. Actually, one of my former students in Taipei, she is part of a group that runs one of those civil society organizations, and she decided to run for the mayor in her town, and that she realized that it's about time that they make that leap, right, to have real power and to think about real kind of structural kind of transformation, but she could not do that before all the work that they have done before. All the work that they have done before create a condition for her to be successful in her campaign, and she got elected because of that. Mm-hmm. So that would be my response to your question.
Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, no, thank you for the question. It's a great question. I hear it a lot too. Yeah, yeah. And I agree with you, Jeff, and what you said in the presentation about it too. I mean, and I think one other way of thinking about a response to that question is that there's an implicit assumption in that question that being taken care of by a neoliberal state is preferable and desirable to taking care of oneself and one's own communities, right? And that's not always the case. That's not always something that we can assume. I think for a lot of people right now, the desire is to take back their own lives and the construction of their own lives in their own hands, and that is seen as more desirable, right? And that I think another thing we always want to remember is that a lot of times being cared for by a neoliberal state can be a terrible thing, right? And so I think what's at stake a lot of times is this question of autonomy and empowerment and taking a hand in one's own existence and really taking up those tools again. I mean, if we think about what has happened in the course of the last couple hundred years of capitalist urbanization and proletarianization, what has happened to a lot of human beings' connection to the tools of life, the means of life. We've been separated from a lot of those things. And so I think there's a possibility of reconnecting to our worlds, to each other, to our environment that is being taken up in a lot of these experiments. And so to me, they have that sort of incredible political potential and context to them too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that makes sense. Thank you. It also sort of occurred to me in many of your examples, Jeff, that a lot of what these mutual aid organizations are doing is they're providing something essential but fairly basic. I mean, it's water. it's charging your cell phone. They're responding to an emergency situation in which our needs have sort of been reduced to, a pretty minimal. And so that's great that we can meet those needs, through these mutual aid networks, but it's not really kind of moving to like a much better world per se. It's like, can I have some drinking water for the next 12 hours? And Stephanie, you were kind of gesturing at wanting to reject the rejection of hubris. But I guess, so what I'm also wondering from both of you is, do these kind of radical approaches, do you see examples or pathways that they can reclaim some sense of maybe not hubris, but at least an optimism, abundance, whatever it is, like moving to a truly better world rather than meeting the bare minimum. I don't want to my house to be underwater. Does the question make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I think it's considered hubristic to even imagine that you could have a better world at this point in history. So that's partially what I mean when I say that we have to reclaim hubris, meaning we have to defy that claim and say that's ridiculous, and I think it's considered hubristic also to think that you could have a real transformation, that there is something other than this, there's something other than a feature of cascading crisis, polycrisis, permacrisis that just gets worsened, that worsens and deepens, It's considered hubristic to say that that's not the case. So for me, I think what's essential is rejecting that claim. And if that's hubristic, then okay, right? But then imagining, well, what would it mean? What would it take materially, technically, spiritually, to make that future, some other future, real? I mean, and I think, I don't. It would be insane, I think, to say that any of these examples are already doing that. It's like we wouldn't. I think it's always what you have to say. We wouldn't be here if we were already doing these things or we knew how to do these things necessarily. But at the same time, I think they give it this like embryonic seed of these like material means that are necessary to transform the world that we have to take back in hand. I mean, but then again, the question of hubris again is, what's the bigger vision of that? Like, how do they link together? How is something much bigger, much more transformative possible? And I don't mean that in the sense of, some kind of like eco-modernist, techno-modernist fantasy, not at all. But, what's another kind of, people-made kind of future, so.
Yeah, I think, a lot of, like Stephanie's example of, the social infrastructure, the example that I have are really just, starting point, right? And that hopefully have a longer, life, beyond just these kind of emergency responses. And I was actually telling this story last night about the political engagement of Asian American community in Seattle. Right? So in the 1970s, there was a huge crisis. This is not, and for the community, it's almost like a sea level rise. Right? So we have the building of freeway that cut through the neighborhood, building of a sports arena, the stadium, that would basically displace all the business around the neighborhood as well. And it was at that point that the community, especially the younger second generation or third generation, realized that they, rather than responding to all these crises at kind of one at a time, they need to be in the government. They need to take power. Right? And that's when they decided they need to join all levels of government in the state of Washington. It's not just Seattle. They have to they apply for jobs in Seattle. They apply for jobs in the state government. They run for offices. We had the first Chinese American county executive, who then became the first Chinese American governor, state governor. Right. That came out of that process.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And these people are still around. Even though the tides kind of go the network of activists, and we're now maybe third or fourth generation now. And this is what hold the community together, starting from that point, like 40, 50 years ago.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, that is an inspiring story. Thank you. I don't want to dominate the discussion. So I'd like to invite the audience to jump in now if there are questions. Just put up a hand and I'll swing by with the mic, or I can let Neil do. Or do you have a question, Neil?
Nope.
Okay.
Just offering.
Thank you. Great presentations. Loved them both. This question is for Professor Wakefield. Having lived in Miami for a few years back in the 90s, I was hearing the whole doom and gloom story about Miami will be sinking into the ocean and all that. Yet, as a property owner still in Miami, I'm surprised by the amount of people who want to move to Miami, especially from California more than anything else. And I'm taking advantage of that, actually. But that aside, my question to you is, what is the draw of Miami if we hear all these negative things about what's going to happen to Miami? What still draws people to Miami in particular? That's my question.
Great question, thanks. I'm glad to hear you're profiting off of the tech relocation from California. I mean, what is the draw of Miami? I mean, it's a magical place. It's not called the Magic City for no reason, right? I mean, it's a total environment. It's a feeling. It's the sky. It's the changing of the clouds every second at sunset, at dawn. I mean, it's the feeling of living at the tip of the country, right? The tip of the known world, right? It is, I think, for some people now, and I think this is true, I think it's also the feeling of living at the end of the world, in the sense of see it before it's gone. I think that's real, and that may be a little bit of the edge to it right now. But also, I mean, there's no other place like it in America. I think that's people go there and they get that feeling and they know it. I mean, I'm sure you feel this maybe. Then again, the other reality of Miami, though, that we know if you've actually lived there, is that that's all lies. That's all a spectacle, right? And that the real reality is oftentimes if you're just a regular working class person or a poor person, you're stuck in your car in traffic trying to get to your job to make minimum wage for your place that is so overpriced you can barely afford, and you are waiting for the bridge that's up, that's blocked traffic, so that some very fancy yacht can cross through, and your boss is mad at you, and you're about to have a heart attack. And that's also Miami, so. Yeah.
I think we had Luke, yeah, and we'll take a couple.
Yeah, thank you so much for both your presentations. It was really, really interesting to see the examples. And I guess my question is also sort of in the vein of thinking about examples, but in this case, maybe not examples of things that have already happened, but examples along the lines of the type of hubris that you mentioned, Professor Wakefield. So I'm wondering if, part of hubris is not fully understanding or not fully knowing, but being able to actually sort of like try narratives or try directions out that you're not even sure of yourselves. So I was wondering if maybe each of you would be willing to just kind of try out some hubristic narrative of something that excites you, some possibility that excites you at whatever scale, in whatever way, that you're not fully sure of yourself, and just kind of test it out on us and see what you think. I have no idea if that's possible, but I would love it if you could try.
I love that question. It's such a good question. Do you want to go first?
Sure. I mean, I think we actually, as designers, we do it all the time. I mean, we kind of know that this might work, but you are never 100% sure. But you put yourself out there, you put your design out there, and then see if it might actually work. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. We go back and fix it. I think the ability to kind of be able to kind of revisit the design, understanding how that might work is kind of ingrained to kind of what we do. I mean, we actually the Street Sync project, we had no idea how successful that project might be when we first started. We got a call from our friends at Real Change to see if we can do something, and then we just put something together, things that we order online, and then it became wildly successful. We got a council member on board who got us more funding, which also became very problematic because it all started out as a grassroots, almost anarchic project. When it was adopted by institutions, it became another animal. And anyway, those are just examples I can share with you.
Yeah, so it's such a great question. And I mean, I think part of the experimental disposition or an ethic of experimentation is about being able and okay with throwing out an idea that's half baked, it's a little crazy, and seeing what sticks, and then discussing it with people, and not being afraid to do that, and actually having spaces where people can do that together. I think that's so essential actually in the world, right now especially. So here's one. I mean, so there's this idea that I think is very exciting, and it's crazy. But you hear a lot about there would be this in a city like Miami or some other cities that there would be a need to just like bulldoze the whole thing and start over and create these artificial island cities to keep the region inhabitable, let's say. And you also see a lot of designer luxury kind of like houseboat, house mansion, luxury eco district, floating luxury eco districts that are getting developed by really high-end design firms. And they're beautiful and they're incredible, but they're completely expensive and out of anyone in this room's price range, probably. And likewise, this idea that there would be these like new artificial islands, they're likely luxury high-rises, for the very wealthy. But what if we imagined building a new Atlantis or new Atlantises of our own? What if instead of seeding that crazy kind of vision of the future to only evil speculation and like some corporation that will own the island or what have you, imagine there was some kind of like network of people that pooled resources and envisioned and maybe even tried to build a new Atlantis or new Atlantises for the world that's coming. I think that would be crazy and very interesting.
Way in the back.
So optimistic, so I'm sorry to bring it back to doomsaying, but Dr. Carver brought up the response of the neoliberal state to these resilience organizations, and as much as the neoliberal state responds by backing away from social services, there has also been a response, particularly in the last 10 years, towards this politics of the armed lifeboat and this hyper-militarization surrounding a more international view of what these crises mean. Do you see a framework within these community organizations for responding to these, issues that begin internationally but then inevitably have militaristic infrastructural consequences for our communities? For anyone.
Well, I mean, I'm from Taiwan. So I mean, we live with that on a daily basis. I mean, and this is like one of those like multi-pronged kind of crises that are happening kind of all at the same time. They're all kind of interconnected, right? So climate change, invasion from China, and the recent events in Ukraine. It creates this kind of anxiety in society, and so the government are having to respond. They're extending the military service from like 4 months to a year. They actually have the public support, and so there's a different kind of mentality these days now that, in some ways, is very problematic. And this might be kind of what you are kind of asking, is that somehow these kind of military preparedness. It becomes a necessity, and there are other like places that have regional conflict as well, and they are being kind of legitimized, and they are sucking resources away from like social services, and then as citizens in Taiwan, that there's no other choice. Like you either do that and try to survive, or you face potential invasion from China. Mm. So it's a very difficult question.
Yeah. I mean, I would just say on that note, I mean, I think, my perspective is primarily in the American urban context, and I think what you see a lot here is that a lot of the turn toward local self-organization in the areas of food, water, energy, and so on, communication, and so on, whether that's preppers or sort of community networks or what have you. I think a lot of that actually is a response to people perceiving exactly what you said, that there is a ramping up of this armed lifeboat kind of mentality. I mean, the militaries of the world have been preparing for climate change for decades and, have some of the best plans in place for it, right? But also, I think it's becoming very clear, especially as we saw in response to the pandemic and as we see in other, world crises, that, the very wealthy, are also very prepared, and that they will have the resources needed to deal with, what crises come, whether that's, drinking water or that's, a very, very nice place to live or what have you, or to defend, the means to defend those places and things, right? So I think a lot of people around the country and probably around the world are perceiving this trend and this trajectory, and so they're turning to these practices of self-sufficiency or survival skills or what have you as a response to that, to say, I'm not going to be subject to that. Right?
Thank you to both of you as well. I really, really, really enjoyed this. I learned more about urban resilience today than I have ever did before. And so my question comes from a little bit from a position of ignorance in this case. I mean, I understood it just from paying attention to what's going on. But as a historian, I'm not particularly up on it. So I want to thank you. And I'd like to know what you both think of this, if this is not too technical or maybe methodological of a question, but it comes from what you described, Stephanie, and I hope I'm not mischaracterizing you, but it seems to me that you identified the sort of tripartite system of urban resilience, right? That involves a landscape, the cityscape, and people, and it seems to be also seems to me that you're arguing that urban resilience, in a sense, your critique is that it's reacting to conditions in an antagonistic way. In other words, it's trying to remediate things by by lifting up buildings. It's about just trying to mitigate the worst effects, right, of these impending catastrophes. Although when the example you give of the Everglades was a bit more, I was thinking more the way in which it seemed to be an attempt to rebalance certain kinds of integrated systems that are not necessarily antagonistic until we mess them up and whatnot. And this made me think then of certain past forms of certain cities who have attempted in the past to create these balances in order to face what would be an existential threat without those balances. And so I was just sort of wondering if you see in your method then, or in this in the way in which you've characterized this, are there ways then out of that, out of that situation of just simply trying to resist, right, increasingly powerful forces that are creating an existential threat? Because the question comes from what I'm thinking you were saying, that the Anthropocene has created the conditions under which we have responded with urban resilience in this mode, because it's an existential threat. Just wondering if there's a longer history in which urban resilience can be actually something that is can be more nuanced, and that there's something we can maybe learn from that in a way, depending on how long of a history you want to make for it. Thank you.
Actually, can I tack on a quick footnote for Stephanie? Just really quick. And what's your take on retreat? Like, against the background of what Neil Atkinson just said, why not just retreat instead of resilience? Or are they dialectically interconnected in some way? Just as a minor footnote to that puzzle.
Just a minor one. Okay. Okay. Thank you so much. That was such a great question. Let me try to answer it. So, I mean, first, I wouldn't say exactly that my critique is simply that resilience is reactive or about adapting or crisis managing, right? I mean, because humans have adapted to environments throughout our entire existence, and that is why we have lived in every part of the world, and that is how humans have come up with incredible inventions and designs and technologies, right? I mean, I think that's one of the most amazing things in the world, So it's not that per se. I think that, the critique that can be lodged against the dominant version of urban resilience, which is only one version, the critique that can be lodged against it is that it's, it's essentially, about, revaluing and reshaping essentially all of life, human life, natural life, the life of oysters. Jeff showed also that idea of oyster reefs as infrastructure. The revaluing all of life as a support for the systems that already exist. So it's about not transforming the systems that are causing these disasters, that have caused the Anthropocene, right? But just managing their effects. A form of sort of managing effects. And I think that maybe is the real critique. I mean, you hear this all the time from people who are otherwise not incredibly radically inclined, let's say, like scientists, biologists, urban planners. They often just lament the same thing. They say, like, at least when we were talking about sustainability before in the urban context, even if it was a somewhat, hollowed out idea too, at least it implied that there'd be a better future, that we'd be improving things. But resilience doesn't seem to always imply that. It's just kind of continuation of what is. That said, like you said, the Everglades example is about restoration and improving, right? So it's a little different. I mean, and I think that there are so many different valences that we see resilience practiced in, and that, I love the Everglades. And like all the people working on that restoration, I definitely want it to be restored, and I want to do everything I can to make that happen. And so, and I think a lot of times, the problem is that, in wanting that to happen and trying to make that happen, scientists and ecologists get sort of, you have to frame it as infrastructure for it to happen, for it to get support. And then that will then lead to what restoration looks like and how it happens. So if you're doing restoration with the intention of rehydrating the ecosystem so that it can buffer the salt water, that might look different from rehydrating it for other goals. That's always in ecological restoration. You always have to ask for what. What state are we aiming for? What's the goal? And a lot of people who actually live in the Everglades, like Miccosukee communities, are really actually unhappy with what the restoration is playing out like right now, because it's being determined by models, computer models and things like this. So yeah, I mean, so it's kind of a long answer, but I mean, I think there are so many versions of resilience, and it really depends on the context. And people use that word to mean so many different things. And if you want to go back historically, like you were suggesting, I mean, I think resilience comes, it definitely comes from, the 60s and 70s systems thinking turns, cybernetics, the shift towards thinking about cities as complex systems, human life as complex systems. And I mean, I think that that was at the time, Sara Holiday Nelson, a geographer, she's written a lot about this. At that time, this was seen as like a revolutionary, transformative model, right? And then, so there's some arguments that that kind of thinking has been a bit captured and enlisted in a neoliberal project. I think you could think about it that way, potentially. Should I answer the retreat one too? Okay, I don't want to talk too much, I'm sorry, but yeah, the retreat one is, I mean, I think it's another case, retreat or stay, adapt or retreat. I think rather than having to decide one or the other as a rule, I think just like ecological restoration, or, it's a question of what's the context, who's asking the question, what do you want, what do you need, and what can you do? I mean, in some cases, I think retreat, yeah, it might make sense. It might make sense to go and, if you have the means and it's possible to found a new city somewhere, if that is what you want to do. But that also, retreat can also mean, the absolute destruction of lifeways, ties to land, traditions. So a part of my family is from Louisiana and New Orleans. And I mean, this is something people are talking about all the time over there. And a lot of the people I do work with are thinking about this in terms of, we don't want to leave the Gulf Coast. We don't want to leave coastal Louisiana. That's our culture, and it's tied to that place. And if we leave, that dies. So then the question becomes, how do we stay? And how do we do that on our own terms? And there are really interesting indigenous communities talking about that in coastal Louisiana and New Orleans under the heading of Bulbancha is still a place. It's a really amazing project, actually. Think about what's the infrastructure for staying on your own terms. But I think it's a case-by-case thing. The people have to ask themselves rather than being subject to it.
Yeah, if I can add to that, our program is actually working with coastal tribes in Pacific Northwest on planning to retreat, right? But even in the scenario of retreating, there's still a question of resilience in terms of culture, right? So how can culture kind of adapt to a new location, and the process of how do you kind of stage the process of retreat so that things can move from one location to another without like an irreversible impact on the community.
I think it's telling though that term that has become the most commonly used term itself comes from like a battlefield context. So it's this sort of military idea, which might be part of the problem, I think. Anyway, I know there's some more hands.
Whenever we're having discussions about any sort of like proposed like new sort of like revolutionary sort of planning, as Professor Brenner pointed out in his class today, there's always the question of who's going to do it and when. That's very difficult, but because I have the privilege of having you here, I'm going to ask you anyways. But when you showed that little like loop model of urban resilience on the presentation, I thought it was very interesting when you talked about how we're entering like a true unknown. And I think that encapsulates also who is going to be like, how are these new movements going to be kickstarted? Who is going to be at this epicenter of the sort of pivoting away from like the urban models that we are familiar with to perhaps like entering some sort of new urban paradigm for a new age? Because when Professor Howe was giving his presentation, there was the discussion of all of these like what one could call grassroots movements of these small community organizations, and one could make the argument that those would be the groups that have perhaps the best knowledge of how these specific communities can change. Like going back to your presentation, Professor Wakefield, about how like houses were built on stilts and things like that to sort of help mitigate climate crisis in that way, and perhaps a way that like top-down change couldn't affect. But also in your earlier response to a question about how a lot of members of the Asian American community who began as a part of these grassroots movements sort of saw the need to like engage in like top-down approaches starting from bottom up, because they saw that most effective change could happen that way. And I'm sure that this won't be the same everywhere and it'll be impossible to know, but I'd be curious to know, as of right now, sitting here in this room, where you believe that this change can kickstart any sort of change about like trying to restructure urban thought. Is this perhaps more of a grassroots bottom-up sort of movement, or top-down, or some mixture of the two?
I might append and ask whether it's going to happen at the university or happen on YouTube.
Yeah, these are great questions. Thank you. Who will it be? Who will do it? Right? I mean, I think in the modern political tradition, there's always this effort to sort of like identify who's the revolutionary subject, who will do it. The proletariat, so on and so forth. And what has always excited me about this moment that we're in historically is that I think that subject is everyone. The Anthropocene, this idea that we're in this new age, the Earth is moving into a new operating state. The codes that we structured modern society are coming undone. This idea of the Anthropocene, it inaugurates a moment where that subject can be anyone, because this unraveling pertains to everyone. And to me, that's like incredibly exciting, because that's a potentially revolutionary moment, And I think that I don't think that we need to limit ourselves to saying it will be grassroots or top down, or it will be low tech or it will be high tech, or it'll be done by X discipline or an X institution. I think the potential, the real promising potential, is in like a cross-pollination of thought, of organization, of experimentation and technical, experimentation, mental experimentation, so on, across all those spheres. So it has to be, I think that the real potential is in, linking up across so many disciplines and fields and types of people to actually build that exit path, or many of them. I mean, I think the thing that it's really important to remember is that we can be really cynical about these design projects that we see under the heading of resilience, or we could be really cynical about some of the, the science that we see out there. But in every field, whether it's urban planning, urban design, what have you, even if there are people who are working on some of these projects that you might want to criticize, there are so many people in those same projects saying, I want to do something way more than this. Like, they really want to change the world. I mean, you see that I think in every field right now. It is the zeitgeist. I'm sure you all feel it too. I'm guessing you do. Yeah. I mean, and I think, so the real question is, like, how do we liberate that feeling? That sounds silly, but how do we open up the potential that feeling is posing for us and actually act on it? So, I mean, there are people in very, high-tech elite engineering fields and companies, and that have skills and like really want to change things. Same in design, same in academia, same in art, same in Starbucks, line. I mean, and so I think the question is that cross-pollination.
Jeff,
Yeah, I mean,
last
I would
thought?
agree. Is everybody? I mean, the fact we're we're living in a liberal democracy, right? So like all the votes matters, and in order to change, politics and political system, I mean, that's if you look at the last few election kind of cycles, is who can build the broadest coalition, to make change. But having said that, I think like for that kind of change to happen, it's going to take a very substantial effort, right? And in the meantime, we need like experiments, innovations, alternative to lead the way, right? And that could be in the form of these kind of grassroots organizations, or it could be people running for office and making institutional change. But something needs to happen, right? And so it's not just everybody, in the society, but also different ways that make change can begin to kind of push the envelope and to show what is possible. And so that's one of the reasons I'm looking at these examples, because that show the potential for those changes to happen.
We're pretty much out of time, and I think that's a pretty nice sentiment to end on. So thank you again, Jeff and Stephanie. Thank all of you for your questions. Thanks again to Carlo and Stella, and Neil, for helping run the show, and thanks for coming. To be continued in your classes and over dinner, and throughout the rest of your studies here. Thanks.
Thanks. Thanks.
Yeah, that's fine.